Hey, everybody, it's your friend Adam. I'm here with another Wednesday debate. Today, we're going to be debating the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what is the affirmative position? Is it the negative position? I am in the negative position. Is that the case? So I hear the affirmative goes first. So I'm here with CM Bradley. I have PSA Sitch in the background, who's going to be doing a little moderation in case we get in case we get super aggro at one another, start throwing things.
Lay down the law.
Yeah, exactly. He's the sheriff in town, so we're gonna try to do kind of a formal setting. You wanted to do a 10-minute opening, and I am going to do my rebuttal, and then we're going to do steel manning of each other's position, and then we're going to do free form exchanges. I think there's 10 of them for 3 minutes, and then we're going to do a 5-minute closing. So we should be about an hour. So I will give the floor to CM Bradley. Links to everyone's channels are in the description. And what is your evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
Okay, so when I saw the topic of the evening is there evidence, or do we have evidence for the resurrection? And I have a very simple argument. And if you give me a moment, I asked for 10 minutes, so I'll expand upon it. But I have a lot written here, so I'm just gonna fly through this thing and hopefully not lose my breath too much on the way down. So here's the argument. Premise 1, per the standard definition of evidence in probability theory, something is evidence if it increases the probability of a hypothesis. Premise 2, there are numerous historical facts that increase the probability of the hypothesis that Jesus was resurrected. 3, therefore, there is evidence for the hypothesis that Jesus was resurrected, or rose from the grave, whatever. Now, since premise 1 is incontrovertible, and premise 3 is merely a concluding premise that follows necessarily from the preceding premises, I'm going to have to catch my breath here. Okay, I will spend the remainder of my time supporting premise 2. Now, to do that, the resurrection is a historical hypothesis. It's not a philosophical, scientific, or even necessarily a theological hypothesis. It proposes that a singular event took place in history and is to be investigated accordingly. To quote Aviator Tucker, historiography does not reconstruct events. It cannot bring Caesar back to life or reenact the Battle of Actium. Historiography does attempt to provide a hypothetical description and analysis of some past events as the best explanation of the present evidence. That being the case, we need to first identify the relevant facts and then evaluate competing explanations of those facts. So let's dive into it. First is the background information, necessary preconditions not directly supportive of the resurrection, such as Jesus' death by crucifixion outside of the walls of Jerusalem. The support of that is found abundantly. Either it's multiply attested in the Gospels, in each 4 Gospels in the Acts of the Apostles, in various epistles, in Josephus's Antiquity of the Jews, in Tacitus's Annals, and E.P. Sanders says that this is one of the almost indisputable facts about Jesus' life. The other background information that isn't directly supportive of the resurrection, but is a necessary precondition, is after his death, Jesus was buried in a tomb nearby. This is multiply independently attested in the Gospels and in the early creed in 1 Corinthians 15. It's implicitly stated there. I'll expand upon that in a moment. Also, Jewish law required burial, even for foreigners and executed transgressors. This is seen in Josephus. Joseph of Arimathea, the man who is reported to have been a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin and that buried Jesus, is unlikely to be a Christian invention. This is supported by the Jewish leadership, were the earliest enemies of the Christians from the gospel passion narratives themselves, and elsewhere in the New Testament and Acts, you can see that the Christians regarded the Jews as those that murdered Jesus. Thus, as Raymond Brown has put it, the burial by Joseph of Arimathea is very probably, since it is almost inexplicable, or very probably true, since it is almost inexplicable why Christians would have a Jewish Sanhedrist or Sanhedrinist do right by Jesus and giving him a burial in the honorable portrayal seen in the gospel accounts, most notably perhaps Luke's account that absolves Joseph of guilt regarding Jesus' death. All right, so that's the background information. Now to get into some of the evidence. There's 3 primary ones. One is the empty tomb. 2 is On different occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people, including skeptics and defected followers, experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. And number 3, their disciples' belief that he had risen from the grave. All right, now to support each of those 3 facts. First one is the empty tomb. Most scholars, not just conservative Christian scholars, but also skeptics and agnostics, accept that the tomb was found empty on Sunday morning. Jacob Kramer, to quote him, said that most scholars by far hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Our earliest reports of the empty tomb reveal that it was women that first discovered the empty tomb. This is regarded as historical because it fits the criterion of embarrassment. Second Temple Judaism was a patriarchal society in which women were not regarded highly, including having unreliable testimony. To quote Josephus, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." To quote the Talmud, "Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid." I can keep quoting, but I'll move on because I have a lot more to cover. Another supporting evidence of this is the proclamation in Jerusalem. In the case of the resurrection, proclaimed boldly upon the spot in Jerusalem, the enemies of Christianity had means, motive, and opportunity to discredit the account if they could. Enemies of Christians, or of the Christians, could have produced the body, but they didn't. The last line of evidence for this is that early enemies of Christians said that they stole the body. The empty tomb is early and multiply attested. Matthew 27-28 gives an account of the decision by the Jewish leader to spin the story by saying that the disciples stole the body, which obviously is implicitly saying that there is no body that they can be given, that can be found. Even if the guards at the tomb was a Christian apologetic invention, which some speculate it is, it would have been in response to claims that the disciples stole the body. Also, in the middle of the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, points out that the Jews are still sending people from city to city, spreading the story that the disciples stole the body. Lastly, there is the Nazareth inscription. It's an imperial marble tablet proclaiming or proclamation against grave robbing, dating circa 41 CE, and prescribing the death penalty for those who rob graves. Some regard this as a reaction to the empty tomb and claims that the disciples stole the body. Now, the second fact, on different occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people, including skeptics and defective followers, experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. There's numerous sources for this. One would be this multiply attested. One is Matthew 28, Luke 24, John 20-21, Acts 1, various sermons in Acts, they're like 2:32, 3:15, 4:10, 20, 5:30, 32. I can go on. And then also, perhaps most importantly, is the creed found in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-7, typically dated within 5 years of Pentecost. The various reasons for that is its mnemonic structure, which means it's a brief creed for the purpose of memorization, used to catechize new Christians. It contains rabbinic statement, which says, "I deliver unto you," and then it lists all the appearances from Peter all the way, and then eventually Paul mentions himself at the end. This is likely either in Damascus. His was likely either in Damascus or in Jerusalem shortly after his conversion, where he was given unto this that he received. He received this tradition and is giving it unto the Corinthians that he's talking to. Also is the use of Kephas in the passage itself, because this is regarded. Excuse me for a second. This is used to ascribe an early date to this creed because Kephas was the early name used for Peter. Peter, as we know him now, was used later on. Now, the defected followers, it was an embarrassing fact for early Christian leadership because Jesus' disciples had abandoned Jesus and were hiding before having experience. They were in hiding, before having experiences of what they believed to have been the risen Jesus, completely transforming them after his death. 2 is skeptics, or the next one is skeptics, including his brother James and the Apostle Paul, who would become the Apostle Paul, Saul of Tarsus. Now, James, according to the Corinthian Creed, Jesus' brother James, the author of the book of James, who did not believe Jesus during his ministry, came to believe that he had risen from the dead after having this appearance experience. 2 is Paul, and not only a disbeliever at the time of his conversion or before his conversion, but a persecutor of the early church, did a radical 180 to becoming a leader of the church and author of a third of the Christian canon. Early Christians were very familiar with vision. Now, I'm losing my place here. All right, I'm almost done. Now, some people ascribe this just as visions, as opposed to a kind of claim of a physical experience. Now, the thing that goes against that is that visions and sightings of people after their death were regarded as evidence that they were dead. Early Christians were very familiar with visions and even claimed to have had some, but preached to have encountered a physically risen Jesus. Lastly, to quote the skeptical scholar Gerd Ludemann, we have no sound way to replace the symbolic interpretation of Jesus' resurrection within the context of earliest Christian resurrection belief. Lastly, the disciples' belief that he had risen. This is a huge paradigm shift. Jewish messianic expectations believed that the Messiah would overthrow Rome and reestablish the kingdom of Israel. There was absolutely no concept or conception of a dying, much less rising Messiah. Jesus was not the only person in antiquity to claim to be the Messiah. However, every other Messiah movement always petered out upon the death of the leader, because he's not supposed to be killed. He's supposed to overthrow Rome, not be destroyed by Rome. The Jewish concept of resurrection was one of an apocalyptic rising of all the dead, not of a singular person in space-time by himself, much less ascending into glory upon that time. This is partly why early Christians at first believed the end of days was coming upon them. One more thing was their willingness to endure persecution and even death. Many people professing to be original witnesses of the risen Jesus voluntarily passed their lives in labor, dangers, and sufferings on account of their belief. Next, these consequences were easy to foresee, as they could not reasonably hope for a favorable reception from the majority of either Jews or of Gentiles. The significance of voluntary suffering. These people were in position to know if what they were claiming was true or false, unlike martyrs dying for the testimony of other people. These people were suffering for what they themselves witnessed. Now, there's a bunch of competing theories, but real quick, how much time do I have?
You're at 11 minutes.
Take your time. Go ahead. Let's hear the competing theories.
Okay, so there's a few different competing theories. Historical methodology as inference to best explanation uses the following criteria in evaluating a historical hypothesis. One is explanatory scope, which is how much of the data it explains. The next is explanatory power, how well it explains the data. Next is plausibility, which is self-explanatory. And then degree of ad hocness, which is the lesser assumptions needed, the better. There's the conspiracy theory, which explains the empty tomb, but it doesn't explain the sincere belief of what would then become the Christians, of the disciples. Doesn't explain, or it doesn't explain the appearances of Jesus to the disciples and to skeptics. Another theory is the twin brother theory, which is much less popular, but still one that is perhaps it explains a little bit more of the data, because it explains most of the appearances and explains the sincere belief, but it doesn't explain the empty tomb. It lacks plausibility, and it's completely ad hoc, that no one knows that he has a twin brother all along, and then he just shows up on the scene out of nowhere just at the right perfect time after his allegedly twin brother's crucifixion. Next is the mythic theory, but this one suffers from it claims that legendary embellishment and contrivance accrue. Oh wait, no, hold on, that's not it. I didn't write down what it is. It was 3 a.m. I should have done this earlier. My bad. But in any case, so the mythic theory says that these were developmental contrivances and legendary myth and stuff. And that's not a very good representation, but it'll suffice for now. The problem with this is that legendary embellishment and contrivance accrue over time, but the reports are very early and multiply attested, rendering this highly implausible. All one has to do to appreciate this point is to compare Mark's account with the wildly legendary stories found in the second century apocryphal gospels, in which Jesus is seen coming out of the tomb with his head reaching up to the clouds and followed by a talking cross. Lastly is the hallucination hypothesis, which is perhaps the most popular hypothesis, which explains the individual experiences, but it doesn't explain the empty tomb. It doesn't explain belief. It explained the belief Jesus was. It doesn't explain that Jesus was believed to have been experienced physically alive after his death. It doesn't explain the criteria for group hallucination. and to claim that multiple group polymodal hallucinations lacks so much plausibility that to rely on it would be to trade in one miracle claim for another. But this one lacks comparative explanatory scope. So to end this out, according to historian, actually I'll scratch that for now. This is only some, not all, of the evidence, and very poorly presented. But for now, I'm not saying that the resurrection happened or that it is even more probably true than not, but merely that there is evidence that Jesus resurrected from the grave. I appreciate you letting me go over time. Much over
so
time.
I want to mention C.M. Bradley has some great videos on Jordan Peterson. You should check out his channel. I want to focus on the probability, and even in the end here, you've said that you don't think that the evidence is sufficient enough that it's more probable than not. So
can I interject, or am I waiting?
Go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Just a real quick. I didn't say that I don't believe it. I just said that that's not what I'm claiming.
Okay, that's not the claim that you're making. Well, I mean, right. the way the affirmative position, and many people have pointed this out in the chat, is obviously there is. You've cited evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So technically, yes, you've won the debate because you're saying that there is evidence. My question is whether or not that evidence is sufficient enough to get that probability up above, I mean,
50.
50 seems like 50 seems improbable to me.
Okay.
I'm curious. My biggest questions about the evidence that you present here is that all of the evidence seems to be written testimony without a good chain of custody for the documentation up until the present day. Now, you've said you cited some evidence that certain people who have given us this testimony may have not had any reason to lie, but we don't necessarily, and I don't necessarily know that they would be lying as much as maybe just misinterpreting what they've seen, or other people involved in that chain of custody of the documentation misinterpreted the actual text. Do we have any kind of good chain of custody of the documentation from the actual authors? I've taken some religious studies classes, and they've said that as far as the biblical narratives go, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they say that those books, that Mark is really the only original text, and there's some missing text that they call Q, and that the other three gospels are compiled from these documents. So the documentation, there's not really a good chain of custody on. So that would be my biggest criticism. And I want to know, and this came up when Mike Winger and Matt Dillahunty had done a debate on this topic. And I'm super curious, like, is there any tangible evidence aside from eyewitness testimonies? Now, I know it's easy to say that eyewitness testimonies are evidence, but in this realm of scientific scholarship, they're probably the weakest form of evidence that there is. So I don't know where we would set that probability. And I think that is the biggest problem with the evidence that's cited. I think the evidence cited here sets the probability of these claims very, very low. And I mean, I don't want to belittle anybody's faith, because this is where faith becomes important, because though that probability, like, I don't know how you could make any kind of scientific claim that we have enough evidence to bring that probability up to above, I don't know, just 5%, just to throw a number out there. So I'll go ahead. I'll go ahead and let you. I guess we're moving into the Steelman phase. So let me you go ahead and steel my position, and I'll go ahead and steel man yours.
Okay. So insofar as I understood you, you kind of threw out there that you don't want to say that any of it was lying, but there might have been some sort of, falsehoods involved. You also said that maybe they misinterpreted the events to be a physical resurrection. On top of that, you said that it seemed that you're mostly just like skeptical of eyewitness testimony. There was something about the chain of documentation, is I think the phrase that you used. After finishing the steel manning part, I would like to know what you mean by that, because I'm not entirely sure what you mean. I think I have a good idea. I just want to make sure we're on the same page on that. But lastly, you said eyewitness testimony is the sort of worst form of testimony in science, and that you're looking for tangible scientific evidence for the resurrection, and you just don't think that we have that.
Well, do we even know where the tomb is?
The tomb, insofar as I understand, there is a place where people believe that was likely his tomb.
Likely. So
in Jerusalem, yeah.
What is the probability of that, and what is the evidence that it's his tomb?
Oh, I didn't look into that specifically, but I'm not sure that's even entirely relevant to establish the claim to debate.
Like any
you gotta
tangible...
steel man his position first, Adam. You're
Okay.
skipping steps.
So let me steel man your position. You're saying that we have eyewitness testimony from several parties that were there at the time, who didn't have any reason to lie or any reason to think otherwise, because they were actually women, and it would hurt their this is harder than it looks. It would hurt their position if they were basically saying something that they would not be able that they shouldn't be saying, something that was politically unfeasible for them to say as women. Am I correct in that? How am I doing here?
Not great, but I can't fault you too much for that, because I presented it very disorganized. So,
Right.
so that's
well,
not.
I do partially remember it from the Mike Winger debate as well.
Sure.
There's something important to the fact that they're women. That women weren't allowed to testify at the time.
Right. Yeah. So the way I would just very, 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 very briefly say is that there's I'm not even talking about necessarily eyewitness testimony. I didn't even use the phrase at all.
Right.
I don't think. Maybe I did once or twice. I don't think I did. But in any case, I'm just saying that there are three historical facts, or at least there are three historical claims, or whatever, if you wish, that people generally agree, or that scholars that are specialists in this area generally agree to be true. And one of which was that there was an empty tomb.
Right, but that was witnessed by somebody and written down.
Right. Well,
correct?
yeah, of course.
Yes.
All of it is based upon eyewitness testimony. Absolutely, that's 100% correct.
So that I'm just cutting to the chase then.
Yeah.
There's an empty tomb that we have eyewitness testimony, but we don't.
Right.
For all we know, that eyewitness testimony is inaccurate. Like we don't have the person that gave that eyewitness testimony. It was written down by somebody.
So you would bring into question that there was an empty tomb, that there were that the disciples and that the defected followers and skeptics had postmortem experiences of Jesus, and then also that the disciples came to believe that Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead.
The only evidence that we have for any of this is written documents, correct?
Along with basically most other things in ancient history, yes.
Right. So the other things in ancient history are usually corroborated from multiple sources. So
yeah, as was here.
All you've cited only the Bible as tangible evidence. Did you cite other evidence?
Not in every single case. I mentioned Josephus for a couple
Yeah,
of the things that I mentioned
Josephus
before.
is commonly, yeah.
Or in Tacitus as well for one of them. But the way, I mean, the Bible is not like a single document. It's a collection of documents.
Correct.
Different genres, so on and so forth. But even within the documents that, like, for example, when I mentioned the Creed in 1 Corinthians, that's the document that we have that mentions something that we believe to, that scholars generally agree to, that goes back to, it's like a, how do I put this?
Right.
In a way that I haven't already articulated it. Like it's content that's earlier than the document that we're observing. Does that make sense?
Just to get back to where the steel manning on the women,
Sure.
because that I heard I heard Mike Winger bring that up as well. Like what is the significance? So I think I'm steel manning your position fairly well here. You're saying that we have eyewitness testimony based on documentation, lots of different historical documents that have been compiled in the biblical narratives. You've also cited Josephus as a corroborative historical document. So Josephus and the Bible both account for an empty tomb, but it's still based on documentation, historical documentation.
Yeah, it's all based on historical documentation. There are a couple things. I did mention something from archaeology, which was the Nazarene tablet or something like, or the Nazarene inscription. There's like, there has been certain this was partly to support the empty tomb, because it would support it. Like, let me go to it real quick.
We have this inscription. What was it inscribed in?
Probably Greek.
But where is it on the earth?
Where is it on the earth? I don't know where it's located on right now. I mean, I can look it up real quick, but
okay. But it is somewhere on the earth. You're saying
yeah, it's somewhere on the earth.
So what is that? What is that inscription? What is the inscription related to? What is the inscription
it's a proclamation against grave robbing. It prescribes death penalty for people who rob graves.
Okay, so but it's unrelated to the specific event.
Well, no, it's corroborating evidence in support. Like it was
that grave robbing is illegal. You're saying, yeah. It's corroborating evidence that grave robbing is illegal.
Do you know why I'm bringing it up, though?
That grave robbing is illegal? Yes, because you want proof that the body was still there. That you want that it
wasn't there.
Yeah. Well, you want proof that the grave wasn't robbed. You also said part of the steel manning.
Well, evidence.
You also said there are competing theories that the Christians came in and pilfered the body. That's one of the competing theories, correct? That you said.
I'm sorry. Repeat that.
There's a competing theory that Christians came in and pilfered the body. That there was no resurrection because the body was taken away by.
Oh yeah,
Jesus.
yeah. Conspiracy theory.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we can think of others like that. But my question is really just what is the evidence that this event ever even took place? Like I'm not even to the resurrection part of it. I'm looking for evidence that there was a body placed in a tomb.
Oh, so you're okay. So you're disputing the background information then.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I'm just looking at that probability. Like, what do we know? What is in the archaeological record? They've come up with all, like, the Shroud of Turin is supposedly the shroud that was put over Jesus when he was laid into the tomb. That's shown to have not been a true relic. You're playing with your pen. I can hear a lot of clicking.
Sorry.
So my question is, like, what physical evidence is there aside from eyewitness testimony?
The physical evidence is the documents that we have, that report the testimony, right? But
now how do we know that those weren't just?
But why is physical evidence necessary here?
Well, it would shoot that probability.
Because
it would shoot that probability up. I mean, we literally have autographs from Julius Caesar.
Okay.
So having like an autograph from Jesus would be amazing evidence. If he wrote a letter before he was crucified, and we had that document actually written by him, that would be a lot more evidence that of this entire event. The evidence that we have, how do we know that
I don't really
evidence?
think so.
How do we
No,
know
I
that
don't see how
evidence?
that would be relevant at all.
What do you mean?
I don't see how having a letter written by Jesus, I mean, if he wrote it after his crucifixion, that'd be significant. But if we have a letter from Jesus or any kind of writing from Jesus prior to his crucifixion, I'm not sure. Well, depending upon the content, I'm not sure how that would.
Do we have
in
any
any
writings?
way increase the probability of the resurrection hypothesis?
Well, it would place Jesus at the scene. Do we have any evidence
of his death?
Yes. Do we have any writings from Jesus?
No.
No, there's no writings of Jesus whatsoever.
No.
If we had a letter written by Jesus that was corroborated,
what would that do?
It would show that Jesus lived, that there was a guy named Jesus.
Do you dispute that Jesus existed?
Not necessarily. Sorry. I'm just looking for any kind of evidence that I'm just saying physical evidence would be
we have physical
helpful.
Evidence in a very broad sense. If you're talking about archaeological
what physical evidence do we have? Mm-hmm. What physical evidence do we have?
Documents are technically physical evidence.
But what kind of chain of custody do we have from those documents to the present? How do we know that those documents weren't forged or developed later in history? That we're talking 2,000 years ago. Like, do we even have the names of the people that did the eyewitness testimony?
We have the names of the eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, I guess we do.
It depends what you mean by that.
Well, the people that witnessed the empty tomb and whatnot that you cited.
Yeah.
Do we have writings from them? How do we know
writings from?
Yeah, how do we know that they weren't fictitious individuals?
Well, that Mary Magdalene was a fictitious individual, or that?
Do we have writings of Mary Magdalene?
No, but you don't need writings from a particular person to establish that they were a historical figure.
Well, it does if we have writings from them.
Helpful to confirm
it
that
would
the
be huge evidence,
but it's by no means necessary whatsoever to establish that someone from history existed. We don't have any writings from Socrates. Doesn't mean he didn't exist, right? Yeah, you wouldn't dispute that Socrates existed. Do you know anyone that disputes that, or like any scholar that thinks that Socrates actually did not exist or was a complete like fictitious individual made by Plato?
I don't know that we don't have writings from Socrates, to be honest with you. So
we don't have writings from Socrates.
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
We know of Socrates from, I think, Sophocles and from Plato primarily.
Right.
Which is even less than what we have for Jesus. But there seems to be a lot more skepticism surrounding the latter.
Yeah, I guess because there's a larger claim being made here with the evidence of Jesus.
Right, but that's irrelevant to the methodology.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would be a lot more comfortable if there was any kind of tangible evidence, or if there was more corroboration of other historical documents. So I guess I've steel-manned your position correctly, right?
I mean, I think you've done a decent enough job representing to a certain extent. Sure.
All you have is documentation and eyewitness testimony, correct?
Well, you say all you have, but that's significant. I mean, that's notable. It's usable. It's enough to infer certain things from history. It's enough to infer, like the three facts that I presented to you: the empty tomb, postmortem experiences, and the belief of the disciples that Jesus was risen from the grave physically. Like all of that stuff. That's like the overwhelming majority of scholars believe that. It's not like
What kind of
It's just
scholar?
pulled out of thin air. Conservative scholars, agnostic scholars, skeptical scholars, like it's not, or liberal Christian scholars as well. Some of which don't even. I mean,
And based on nothing more than the documentation,
right?
based
I mean,
on
that's how history is done.
Josephus and the Bible.
Josephus was only necessary. Like he's kind of a small figure in this, honestly. He was only necessary for establishing two supporting points or supporting evidence for the background information that after his death, Jesus was buried in a nearby tomb.
When did Josephus live?
First century.
Do we know the dates he lived?
37 to 100 AD.
Oh, right.
37 to 100 AD. So he was alive
Glad to hear
during.
from you, Sitch.
So he was alive when Jesus was alive, or I guess he was born.
Well, if he was born in 37, that's what
four
he said,
years.
right?
Yeah, he was born 4 years
so-
after Jesus passed away. So
He was
didn't-
born in the same century, but not, yeah.
right. But he couldn't have been like a reporter on the beat. He couldn't have interviewed anyone. How did he?
Well,
how did he compile?
He could
how
have,
did he get his?
mhm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, he could have all right. So, what the point in Josephus for supporting the point that after his death, Jesus was buried in a nearby tomb, which is one of the background information, background facts. The whole point of bringing up Josephus was to show that Jewish law required there to be a burial of crucified victims, even for foreigners. Which is like, I can go to the particular passage in Josephus to where he mentions that as like where that's a Jewish law, but that's one of the supporting things that's corroborating evidence that Jesus was buried in a nearby tomb like that. So that's one, like, for example, in the Gospels and in some of the Gospels, at least, which like they're independent of each other in a lot of respects, and in burial accounts, it says that Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus in a nearby tomb in Jerusalem. And then we have in Josephus this claim that Jewish law requires a burial.
Right. So all Josephus does is confirm that the custom of the time was to bury people in a tomb.
Yes.
So all I'm saying is from a modern scientific perspective, like if you don't have a body, you don't have anything to investigate. Like without any kind of material evidence, it's very difficult to.
Well,
to
this isn't a
claim.
scientific claim. This is a historical claim.
Right. Exactly. Yes. I don't know that you can make a scientific claim. That's my question is what does that probability get up
Does that
to
make it untrue?
if it's possibly, yes. So much of history is apocryphal. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not.
Okay.
I mean, we look for evidence to confirm certain things. We look for eyewitness testimony. Like I read history all the time, and they actually read passages from people who lived at the time and kept journals and that kind of thing. Do we have any journals? Was anyone journaling at the time of Jesus? Was Mary Magdalene journaling? None. We don't. Like all of the evidence that we have could be simply people saying that this is the story. This is our historical culture. Like this, it doesn't necessarily rise to like something that we could bet on.
I'm not following the line of reasoning. Why not?
What would you say the probability is at? It just without anything but eyewitness testimony from people that we don't necessarily know. We don't have any kind of chain of custody on the documentation. How do we know that somebody didn't just sit down and make this stuff up?
How do we know that people didn't make it stuff up? Well, I mentioned that because there's multiple independent attestation for a lot of these different facts that I presented. There's enemy. There's also
if someone sat down and made it up, wouldn't they make it up with the cultural milieu of the time? Like how is that? How is that evidence?
That's exactly why some of the stuff is regarded as this is why the majority of New Testament scholars believe some of these facts. For example, the belief that Jesus was resurrected after his grave. I mentioned before that first century Jews had absolutely no concept whatsoever of a dying Messiah. The concept of a Messiah was one who would come in and take and overthrow Rome and reestablish the kingdom of Israel. But so anyway, and I mentioned before other Messianic movements that all petered out, that all died out immediately after their leader was killed, because you can't have a dead Messiah. And so that's why I said, like you mentioned, is there anything, the cultural milieu and everything? Wouldn't they be pulling from the cultural milieu? All of this went completely against the cultural milieu.
Right.
Which is why historians believe that this is likely true.
Why don't they believe that it's just likely popular?
What do you mean? What's likely popular?
Well, I'm sure that the other people that were writing were that clicking is just
sorry. It was a different click. It was the mouse this time. I was okay.
What evidence do we have that this wasn't just fabricated as a story that people enjoyed and liked sharing, and therefore it became popular and made it I don't understand how, because they went against the cultural grain, because it was a very different story than people were expecting, that makes it necessarily true. Like, in order for something to be true, don't we need some kind of physical corroborating evidence?
Like the documents?
Well,
I mean, what kind of evidence are you looking for? Like, what do you have in mind?
I would like to know where the tomb is. I would like to have writings from Jesus. I would like to have a journal from Mary Magdalene.
What would that help you with? And how would you think that that's not just contrived as well? What would the tomb do? Like, it's been 2,000 years. Of course, it would be empty by now. And if the bones of Jesus were still there, then that would be falsifiable, like evidence in the bag. That would disprove the whole theory, right? I mean, what would the tomb even do?
Writings of Jesus would be helpful. Writings of Mary, from Mary Magdalene.
In what way? Why would that be helpful? What would that be helpful for?
Well,
how would you know it's from Jesus?
We would be able to carbon date it. We would be able to tell that it was from that time period. There would be cultural evidence. I mean, in just what she said, we would learn all kinds of things. Don't you think?
Well, like what? I don't know what you mean.
Well, there are.
What would we learn?
Well, there are journals from people that lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago that we learn a lot about. I mean, we have stuff from ancient Rome. There is writings from this time period, is there not? I mean, they have records of commerce and whatnot.
I'm skeptical that you would find them trustworthy to any degree, because everything that I mentioned, a lot of the stuff that's exactly what they are. Documents. You're talking about other documents. How come we don't have more documents? I mentioned documents.
Do we know who these documents are from?
Some of them, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's debate.
Do we know the authors?
Some of them, yeah. There's debate there. Some people would claim a lot more, and then some people would claim less. But
so why are they debating over the authorship of these documents?
Because there's room for debate.
Right. So they're not even sure. You're giving me a hard time for my skepticism, and you're saying the scholars are still skeptical.
I'm just not sure that you entirely. I'm not sure you're being entirely consistent, because you're asking for corroborating evidence and independent attestation of various events when I'm providing that.
Right. Well,
perhaps I wasn't very clear with it, because
no, I understand the documentation that you have. It's all eyewitness testimony from people who do we even really know if it was eyewitness testimony? Do we know if the person that found the empty tomb wrote something down and handed it to somebody, or how long after this person there was a person who stepped into the empty tomb, right? Was that person interviewed by somebody?
People, yes. I mean, that's what's generally understood to be the case, and that's why I mentioned the women, because women, the whole point was that women were like that. The testimony of women, this was an extraordinarily embarrassing fact for the early church, which is why scholars generally believe it to be accurate, is because it fits the criterion of embarrassment. So that's one reason why they think it's true. Not necessarily that, Jesus was physically raised from the dead. That's true. But that there was an empty tomb, because it's the earliest reports say that it was women who found the empty tomb, and it was known in that time, which was a very patriarchal, sexist culture, that thought the testimony of women was abhorrent and next to worthless. That there was no reason why the early Christians would make this up if it was indeed contrived. If it was indeed contrived, they would have someone else, like Joseph of Arimathea, for example, finding the empty tomb, or Peter or John, one of the authorities of the church. They'd have to bolster the authority even that much more, something like that. So that's one reason why. I mean,
right. Your argument is that if they were going to lie, they would have made the lie better, because the lie that they or the testimony that they put forward is weak, and they would use stronger testimony if they were making it up. That's your argument, correct?
In essence, yeah. I mean, they're using like very, very, very weak. Yeah.
The eyewitness testimony is it's not good evidence. It's not good evidence today. I mean, we're talking about people that are coming out and talking about accounts from 30 years ago that are tough to believe. My biggest problem is that if this event took place and there were players involved, human beings involved with faulty memories, if somebody didn't write it down immediately and there's some plausible chain of custody for that documentation to get from them to us 2,000 years in the future, we would have to have some kind of tangible evidence to follow that chain of custody. But I don't think we have it. So I think the probability, I mean, it may very well be true. It may very well be true. I just don't think that we have solid evidence for it. And it's difficult for me to imagine that if we had the journal of Mary Magdalene, or who were the players that saw the empty tomb? It was Mary Magdalene and...
Yeah, there were like a couple Marys.
Okay. So if we had the journal of the three Marys that we could carbon date to no, I'm dead serious. Would not this be better evidence? You keep saying to me, like, why is that important?
I'm smiling at something else.
Well, I'm not.
Why
do you think the Catholic Church made up the Shroud of Turin? Why do you think they made these artifacts? Why do you think they have artifacts that are like a chip of wood from the cross of Jesus? Why do you think they invented these artifacts?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a long history of bogus relics for sure.
Why? If we have this great evidence already, what is the motivation to create this bogus evidence?
Well, listen, you said a lot of different things there. I mean, you mentioned before eyewitness testimony, how it's unreliable. You mentioned before the transmission of the text. And you mentioned that 2,000 years later, and then everything else you just said in the last 30 seconds. So if I could address some of them at least. So the transmission, what's important is not like the time from the event up until today. The importance is the time of the event up into what documents or testimonies or whatever that we have, what was written down. So if it was like, if we get from like 2,000 years ago to like 33 AD to today, and now someone's writing something down, that's a little bit different. You only have oral tradition to rely upon, which isn't necessarily bad. But in any case, you mentioned before the transmission of the text. Like, that's a completely different issue, is the transmission of the biblical documents of, like, let's say the letters of Paul or the Gospels or the apocryphal writing or whatever it might be, like all the way up until today. That's a completely different issue. And then also the eyewitness testimony is only unreliable if events happen quickly. Like there's a few different things that take into account. There's a few different conditions. One is when the event happens quickly. Another one is when people, was when the participants in the event are unfamiliar with one another, so like they're all strangers, and also particularly when there is a weapon involved, because that's where all the focus goes. If you're trying to stay alive, there's a weapon, you know. So, and during these accounts, you're not dealing with people who are strangers to each other, right? Like during the Jesus's brother was pretty familiar with them, or his brother was familiar with Jesus. Paul might not have been. He may or may not have been. But the apostles knew who Jesus was. They were all some in the group experiences. They were all around each other during the experiences. There's also private experiences as well, and also the women at the tomb. They know who Jesus was, so there's not strangers involved in that. And also, a lot of these accounts didn't happen within a few seconds or a couple minutes, but were prolonged. So at least the ones of which we know and have a certain degree of other like corroborating testimony for.
Aren't you just getting this from the story though?
What story?
The Passion story. How many sources are there? How many sources are there? How many eyewitness sources are there from the Passion of the Christ story? We're not counting Mel Gibson here. How many eyewitnesses were there to see the crucifixion of Jesus and the putting into the tomb and the rolling away of the stone? How many eyewitnesses were there and writing this down at the time?
How many eyewitnesses were there at the crucifixion, at the burial, and then what was the last one?
The resurrection.
The resurrection. I mean, we have I can't always recall how many women were at the tomb. I think that actually is.
Do we have any written accounts from the people that were there? From the actual people?
Which one are you talking about? You're talking about all of them?
There was a crucifixion that took place. I'm assuming a bunch of people were
different at different events.
Right. So a bunch of people were standing around watching this crucifixion. The Roman soldier stabs Jesus in the side. Like, was anyone there writing this down? Was anyone there, was a reporter on the beat writing this stuff down? Do we have documentation that comes from that event? You're laughing because I'm assuming it's no.
I'm laughing because that would be an absurdly like high, unreasonably high standard to be able to consider something as historically accurate. To have a reporter on the event.
I mean, what do we mean by historically accurate? I mean,
that it took place.
Do we have? So you're saying zero? There's nobody that was there that was writing this down. Zero people were there.
I don't think there is anybody writing down.
So when they left,
now.
They're all talking about it. They're all having, they're all caught up in what is going on. Correct? They leave. How long before they talk to somebody that actually starts writing things down?
For the Passion?
For these people, these eyewitnesses of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, how many of them started talking to reporters? When did the reporters come in? When did this documentation get written down?
Well, I mean, we have accounts of the Passion from each independent gospel, and we also have it from Josephus, and we have it from Tacitus. Those, not all of them were eyewitnesses to the event, but they all get their information from eyewitnesses.
Matthew, Luke, and John were compiled from Mark and Q, and we don't even know if Mark and Q were eyewitness accounts. So Luke was writing a story based on another text. He wasn't an eyewitness. I'm saying there were eyewitnesses there. If it happened, there were eyewitnesses there, right? You're saying it happened. I'm saying where were the eyewitnesses? Even if there were, let's say there were 5 eyewitnesses there, okay?
Okay.
If those 5 eyewitnesses were writing their account of the story just in their journals, and we had those journals, and we could look at the journals, That would be massive evidence. That would be gigantic evidence. Would it not?
If there were journals of the eyewitnesses talking about the crucifixion,
What they witnessed, yes, exactly.
Well, how do you know that they weren't? That Mark wasn't an eyewitness. That John wasn't an eyewitness.
Well, just from my own study.
Are you suggesting that they were not?
We don't know that Mark was an eyewitness.
Okay.
The number that I've heard is that Mark was written 70 years after this Passion story. 70 years.
Okay. There's a range.
That's a long time. So
70 years after the Passion story? No, I don't think so. 70 years is, if you're thinking 70 AD is when Mark was written, that itself is already a pretty
Mark was supposedly written around 70 AD from what I remember.
Depends who you ask. But
okay, so what do you have a date on that?
But that's not 70 years after the event. That'd be a few decades, but even within that, you have to ask, where are they getting the information from, right? You said before that, Mark is getting Matthew, Mark, and Luke are getting their accounts from Q, which is a theory for some, not all of their accounts or all of the content. But that itself suggests that, the testimony itself or the story itself, the source material that they're pulling from is earlier than those documents itself. So that doesn't help your case, and that they're later and later.
The source material that Mark is pulling from, like Q, we don't even have. Q is supposedly a lost document.
Okay.
So we can't we can't find the chain of custody on this Q thing.
But do you know why? Do you know real quick? Do you know why the Q thing is even like speculated about, that there was a Q document?
Because
because there's evidence from the documents.
Yeah, the textual analysis. They analyze the texts, and there are portions that are just copied verbatim.
And they made inferences based off of those documents that they regard as historically plausible.
Right, plausible, but
which is the entirety of my. I mean, that's just plausible. It might be a lot more certain than of which I'm aware. I'm not like a New Testament expert by any means. My understanding was that Q wasn't like fully like everyone thinks that it was legit, but maybe it is. But in any case, like the way that you're talking about Q as if you know that that's true, but the means by which people or historians infer that there was this Q document is the same means by which they established that there was an empty tomb, that there's post-mortem experiences, and that the disciples believed in a physical resurrection, that Jesus was physically raised from the dead. And that these are the pieces of evidence that the vast majority of scholars agree to be accurate historically. But you don't I'm seeing you apply different standards in different situations.
Well, I'm only applying a standard based on what evidence we actually have. Like if we have a written account, we have evidence
of an empty tomb.
No, we have evidence that somebody wrote something down. Like that's really all we have.
Uh-huh.
And unless we have unless we know that, that they were there, unless we have some way of some evidence that they were actually there and writing, we don't have much of anything. My whole thing is that we don't really have enough evidence to state with the kind of certainty that many people are stating that these events took place. I wish we had more evidence. I honestly do. But it strikes me this is where faith becomes necessary, because there just really isn't the evidence. I mean, there's a lot of things in history that we don't have evidence for. I mean, the historians are grateful when they stumble upon a journal from a captain of a ship, because he's talking about things that are going on in the world at that particular time. And we can piece those pieces together. But unfortunately, with this situation, we just don't have that.
How do you know that journal is completely contrived?
What journal?
The journal that of whatever, some sailboat, some captain or whatever that you just talked about.
Well, they have other journals of the time.
You just know that someone just wrote something down, right?
Yeah. We don't, unless there's corroborating evidence, unless there's other lines of evidence.
Like if there's other people testifying to the same thing, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's my point. That's a criterion of multiple attestation.
Yes, but all you have is Josephus, which wasn't.
I'm not sure you understand why I'm mentioning Josephus. Like, I'm not saying that Josephus said
Well,
that there was an empty tomb. Like,
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, he wasn't there. There's no eyewitness testimony.
Well, no, I didn't say that either.
There was nobody witnessed the event and wrote it down immediately.
No, that wasn't even like the type of culture that they lived in. You're applying like modern standards back to 2,000 years ago.
Right, but we're talking about modern
These are
standards.
predominantly oral culture.
We're talking about modern standards of evidence, though. Modern people.
No, we're talking about just modern historical standards of evidence. Yes.
Mm-hmm. By modern standards of evidence, what will we place the probability of the resurrection of these events transpiring as they did by modern standards of evidence?
I wouldn't be able to give you a specific figure. I don't know percentage wise. I think that the case, which can be made much better than I can make it, is pretty plausible. And I'm not even exactly a Christian, but I think that you can make a really good case for the resurrection. There's definitely evidence for it.
Well, I'll grant you that there is.
Than not. I mean, I think it's the best hypothesis that explains those three facts that I mentioned before. That's agreed upon by the majority of New Testament historians or scholars, and the sort of standards of historical methodology that you're talking about that would be good, where you're in agreement on that it's good for certain situations like the sailboat captain in the ocean or whatever it was. You seem to disregard when it comes to the documents collected in what would later become known as the New Testament.
Right, because we don't. The sailboat captain, we know there's other documents that go along with his journal. There's all kinds of documentation. Like we have written evidence of, Columbus, Spanish conquistadors. We have ship's logs. We have all kinds of corroborating evidence. There's tons of evidence that we can look at. This situation, we don't have much evidence. We have something that's been compiled, which is the Bible, which I agree with you is a lot of different lines of writings, but we don't have any way to tether that writing to people. So for all we know, it's just a story.
No, I mean, for example, the Creed in 1 Corinthians that mentions the various appearances to the disciples is written by Paul. That much is unanimous insofar as I'm aware, that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and that this creed that embedded within 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3-7 goes back to as early as 5 years within from Pentecost. And it's believed, like and I mentioned before the various lines of reasoning why scholars believe that.
Paul, I mean, when did Paul live?
Paul, he lived in the 1st century.
Right.
I don't know a specific dates, like what year to what year, but
you understand the point that I'm making, right? No one was there writing this down. So how long did the oral tradition go on for? How long did they talk about this event before somebody started writing this stuff down?
That's a good question. How long? I don't know. It depends on how early you date some of the Gospels or the of Paul's writings. Like I don't know when 1 Corinthians was written, right, off the top of my head. But it's earlier than the Gospels.
Which is better evidence?
It's within the first, like it's within decades, like very low decades. I'm pretty sure.
I go out to lunch with my attorney, and we talk about a case. Okay. I take notes during that luncheon. I take specific notes about the case, this and that, and this date and that date and this date and that date. Okay. And I have that piece of paper. Okay. In the second scenario, I go out with my attorney and we talk about a case, and I don't take notes. I remember it. 1 year passes, 2 years pass, 3 years pass, 5 years pass. And I decide I'm going to take my notes from my memory of that luncheon with my attorney. Which piece of paper is going to have the more accurate information on it?
Right. I understand your point. But that you're applying a contemporary culture to your what is it? You're applying the standard of a now digital, but a literary culture to one that was predominantly oral. So
Right.
like you're like the way our methods and our memories just aren't as good. Not that we don't have like worse capacities, but just as far as implementation is concerned, there's styles within a lot of these writings that reveal some things that have techniques for memorization. Like, for example, in that creed that I mentioned.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's not like they're just not saying anything for 5 years or whatever.
Yeah, they're repeating the story, but
right.
From a modern perspective, we understand how
and they're willing to go to their deaths for it. They believed in it so much, or believed it so sincerely.
So were the Raelians, who
I don't know who those are.
It was a cult in California. I mean, were the Jim Jones cult. I mean, people are willing to go to their deaths. We can't trust the human memory. We have to trust the evidence. We have to trust what we can look at with our eyes, what we can study. So we've been talking forever. Our free form has gone on for a long time. I don't know if I ever steelman you, but let's get to closing arguments. Sitch, do you know, is there a rule on who goes first for closing arguments?
I mean, you can go first since you went second in the beginning.
Well,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, you can go ahead first if you like.
I'm super curious about this
or
stuff.
I can.
And I completely agree with Bradley on how the culture is influential. Modern people want evidence that is of similar evidence to the evidence that we encounter in our everyday lives, that is kind of, we've been culturally primed for. So I think that shades our understanding of these events, and even if they were an oral tradition, I think that might make things even worse, because they weren't as worried about it being physically accurate to the events that took place. They were worried about it being narratively powerful, which I think there's no argument here that the story itself is narratively powerful, and it's influenced people for thousands of years and will likely continue to influence people. So I wish that we had better evidence. I honestly do. I wish that Bradley could come in here and give me all kinds of eyewitness testimony from the time, from the people, stuff that we could look at, carbon date, but we don't have that evidence. So I think this is where faith becomes important. So I'll let you go, Bradley.
Right.
You're laughing at me, man.
Because the way you sneaked in, faith becomes important there. I mean, you're not even talking to someone of faith per se, but
Oh, really?
But
you are a Christian though, correct?
That's a complicated question.
Okay, well, I'll let you do.
I'll take the JP answer on that. Yeah.
Okay.
But in any case, I mean, so the notion was, is there evidence? I gave what constitutes evidence according to probability theory, and how there's various facts that support the hypothesis that Jesus resurrected. 3 of those facts were the empty tomb, the postmortem experiences, and the belief that the disciples had that Jesus was physically risen from the grave. All of those facts, the majority of New Testament scholars agree to be true. It agreed to be facts themselves by both conservative Christians, liberal Christians, and non-Christian scholars. Obviously, it's not 100% unanimous on each one of those, but I also presented lines of reasoning and evidence for or support for each of those facts. Adam suggested that eyewitness testimony is unreliable. I listed some conditions under which the conditions under which eyewitness testimony is unreliable, and how they're not the condition that the testimony or the eyewitness testimony as it concerns the resurrection is not, they don't fit the conditions for unreliable eyewitness testimony. He asked regarding the certain specific historical questions that, quite frankly, I just didn't have the answer to, and so I couldn't do any better than that. So that's about a wrap.
So you can let us know in the comments below who won this debate. I see there being some commentary in the comments on that. So you're making a play that Sitch actually won the debate. Thank you so much for moderating, Sitch. You were absolutely
that was wonderful.
Essential.
Out of the way. Yes.
Essential to this. Do you have anything else you want to say, Bradley?
I would just want to say that if you want to find a much better case for a resurrection, you can check out Mike Winger, William Lane Craig, Tim McGrew, Lydia McGrew, or Mike Lacona, and all of them present the case in pretty persuasive fashion.
All right. So we'll go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, guys, and we will see you next Wednesday.